Wounded Cowboy was about to die.
Don't worry, you're gonna
but the
be okay.
Apache woman's whisper, "Don't go," brought him back to life. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Late autumn, 1882. The borderland between Arizona and New Mexico stretched wide and empty, dust rolling across the ground with every gust. The air grew colder by the minute. Rowan Pike, a 38-year-old former cavalry scout turned quiet drifter, forced one foot in front of the other along a rocky riverbed, but his strength was nearly gone. A bullet sat lodged under his left ribs from an ambush earlier that day, for men on horseback who wanted what he carried, a small saddlebag with military papers and proof of payment owed to him. He killed one of the attackers before fleeing, but he paid for it with blood. Rowan had spent his life in service and violence. He fought under commanders who gave orders without caring who died fulfilling them. He buried friends with his own hands. He failed to keep his brother alive during a raider attack years ago, a memory that never left him. Now he lived quiet and alone, moving job to job, never staying long enough to create expectations or attachments. This trip was meant to be simple. Deliver the documents, get paid, ride away before trouble found him. Trouble found him anyway. His boots dragged through wet sand as his legs finally folded. He hit the ground hard, forcing a groan from his chest. He rolled onto his side, trying to breathe slow, but air refused to fill his lungs properly. He pressed a hand against the bullet wound, feeling the heat and the sticky blood soaking through his shirt. His eyes blinked against the blur, trying to stay awake, but darkness kept pushing in at the edges. He realized with a dull calmness that he might die here, alone, without saying a single word that mattered to anyone in a long time. Ayanna, just 24 with bronze skin and sharp eyes that missed nothing, moved quietly through the same canyon, barefoot on cold stones. Her slender figure shook with exhaustion. Rope burns circled her wrists, marking recent captivity. Her deerskin dress hung, torn, and too thin for the cold. She had fled a trading post that morning where men argued over her price. She had been taken from her tribe months ago during a raid. They tried to break her spirit, but she never let them take her will to survive. Now, every step she took away from those men felt like a battle won. She traveled downriver, searching for a place to rest. She stopped suddenly when she saw a boot sticking out behind a clump of brush. Her heart jumped. Her first thought, danger. She scanned the area, listening for voices, horses, anything that meant he was not alone. Silence. Only the rush of water and her own heartbeat. She approached slowly, ready to run if he moved wrong. Rowan lay motionless at first. Then his fingers twitched. His eyes opened halfway, glassy from pain and fever. Ayanna stepped back, fear tightening her shoulders. She had every reason not to trust white men. The last few she met tried to claim her like property. But Rowan's condition told another story. His lips were cracked. His face was pale. His breathing uneven. He was not a threat. He was dying. She hesitated. Helping him would slow her down. It might get her caught. No one ever helped her when she begged for mercy. She could leave him exactly as she found him and no one would call it wrong. But she saw that his eyes, tired and dim, did not look at her like she was something to own. They looked like someone who had lost too much and no longer expected anything good from the world. Ayanna knelt beside him. She whispered something under her breath in her own language, her voice low and uneasy. Then, sighing once with frustration and fear, she made a decision she wasn't sure she'd be proud of later. She hooked her arms under his and began to drag him off the open ground. Rowan tried to speak, but only a strained breath came out. His mind worked slower than his body. He realized she was helping him, and confusion cut through the pain. Why would she? What did she want? He tried to reach for his gun, instinct telling him to be careful, but his arm felt like dead weight. When he saw her avoid the weapon entirely and struggle just to move him, suspicion faded and something else took shape. Gratitude mixed with disbelief. Ayanna pulled him beneath a wide rock ledge, far enough to block wind and hide his body from anyone riding past. She ran to the river, scooped water into her hands, and returned to moisten his cracked lips. She tore a strip from the lower part of her dress and pressed it hard against his wound. Rowan sucked in a breath as pain shot up his chest. He forced out a hoarse whisper, "Why?" His voice was rough, barely sound at all. Ayana didn't answer at first. She looked toward the canyon mouth, imagining men on horseback emerging any moment. Her chance to run farther into freedom was slipping. Still, she remained. Finally, she said quietly, "I know what dying alone looks like." That was her truth. She had seen too much suffering that meant nothing. Rowan swallowed, throat burning. His thoughts moved slow, but he understood enough. She saved him because she could not walk past another abandoned life. He didn't know her story, not fully, but he felt its weight in every bruise and scar that spoke for her. Night pulled across the canyon. She gathered fallen branches, striking rocks together until sparks lit a fire. Rowan watched her through heavy eyelids as she wrapped her arms around herself and kept looking into the darkness, always expecting shouts or footsteps coming for her. She wanted to leave. Every piece of her warned that staying was a mistake, but leaving felt worse. Leaving meant letting another person's life be thrown away, just like she had been. She looked over at him once more. He was barely conscious. "You stay alive tonight," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor under it. "Then I go." Rowan didn't have the strength to answer, but inside, a quiet thought formed and held steady. If she stayed, even for one night, then maybe there was still something left in his life worth fighting for. The fire crackled. His breathing steadied. Fear and relief pulled against each other inside her chest. She sat close enough to hear him breathe, far enough to run if she had to. The night grew colder, but neither of them faced it alone anymore. The night moved slowly, every minute stretching longer as Rowan drifted in and out of strained sleep, his body fighting fever and blood loss while Ayana stayed near the fire, trying to stay awake because if she fell asleep and those men tracked her this far, they would find both of them unprepared, and the thought of being dragged back in chains made her stomach twist hard enough to keep her alert even when her eyes wanted to close. She checked the bandage she had pressed against his ribs, noticing how dark it turned as more blood soaked through, and a sharp worry tightened her chest because she wasn't trained to treat such wounds. She only knew how to keep someone alive long enough to reach help in her tribe, but now her tribe was days away, and she had nothing to rely on except the simple knowledge that warmth and clean water could keep death back a while longer. Rowan stirred, breath catching, his hand twitching toward the bandage like he wanted to rip the pain away, and she pressed his fingers gently down, whispering, "Don't," because she needed him still and calm. He blinked at her through a haze that made it hard to understand where he was or why someone knelt beside him instead of leaving him to the night. Questions rolled through his fog mind the way water tried to find ground underneath, his voice rough when he finally managed to speak. "Who are you?" His words broke apart halfway from dryness and exhaustion and confusion, because he didn't remember much beyond falling and seeing her face for a brief moment before darkness nearly took him. She hesitated, her gaze shifting down for a second before she answered. "Ayana," because names mattered. Names were the one thing no one had fully stolen from her, and saying it out loud reminded her that she wasn't the property those men tried to claim. She was still herself, someone who made decisions even if fear tried to take her choices away. Rowan tried to nod, but pain stopped him, his jaw clenching tight. He forced out another question slowly. "Why do you stay?" Since nothing in his experience made sense of it. Strangers didn't save men who could offer nothing in return, and he felt something like guilt that she risked herself for him when he might still die before dawn. Ayana looked toward the river while she thought, trying to form an answer that didn't reveal more of her weaknesses than she wanted to expose, and she finally said, "I could not walk away," her voice even yet strained, because she didn't want him to know how close she had been to leaving him, how she almost chose survival over kindness, because kindness had cost her too much before. Rowan heard the unspoken truth in her tone, and his thoughts slowed enough for clarity too. Settle. She was still herself, someone who made decisions even if fear tried to take her choices away. Rowan tried to nod, but pain stopped him, his jaw clenching tight. He recognized the same exhaustion and mistrust shaping her decisions that shaped his own, like she carried her own ghosts and losses that forced her to keep distance from everyone. And something inside him softened in a way he couldn't show yet. Because gratitude still felt like a heavy thing to hold, he scanned the cave with his eyes alone, since moving anything else hurt too much. Noticing how the stones blocked the wind and how she arranged their few supplies, a fire pushing heat into the dark corner where he lay, her torn clothing drying near the flames. The saddlebag she took off his horse set beside the wall, untouched, a sign that she wasn't trying to rob him or use him. Another detail that confused him more than it comforted him. Ayana followed his gaze and answered the question he hadn't asked yet. "Your horse ran when you fell," she said quietly, remembering how she saw hoof marks leading away into the brush. "You might reach him tomorrow, if you can stand." The way she said if made Rowan understand she doubted his chances, but didn't want to tell him outright that she didn't believe he'd survive more than another day or two without help better than she could give. The fire hissed as a log split, and Ayana flinched before forcing herself still, because sudden noises made her expect a whip crack or boot steps behind her. She was still herself, someone who made decisions even if fear tried to take her choices away. Rowan tried to nod, but pain stopped him, his jaw clenching tight. Rowan noticed it, his eyes studying how fear pulled her shoulders tight even though she tried to hide it. So he asked low, "Men after you?" Not accusing, just needing truth so he could understand what danger followed with her presence. She didn't respond right away, jaw clenching as she searched for words safe enough to share, because telling too much about where she came from or what happened to her could put power into someone else's hands again. But she finally said, "They took me from my family. They sold me." And that was enough. Rowan's stomach twisting with anger, he didn't have the strength to stand up and act on yet. "Will they look here?" he asked next, knowing the answer, but needing to hear her say it, because if trouble came, he had to prepare even if he could barely lift his head. "Yes," she replied without hesitation, her eyes fixed on the canyon mouth again. "They won't stop until they find me." Rowan absorbed that truth without panic, because trouble was no stranger to him. He had faced worse odds and lived, but right now, he couldn't even defend himself, let alone protect her, and that frustrated him more than the pain from his wound. Ayana adjusted the cloth on his ribs again, her fingertips careful and steady, and Rowan breathed hard through clenched teeth, fighting the urge to cry out because showing weakness felt dangerous even here. Up, sweeping dirt across the narrow canyon floor, and Ayana fed the fire more branches, pushing heat toward him because warmth meant life, and she needed him alive until morning. He had faced worse odds and lived, but right now, he couldn't even defend himself, let alone protect her, and that frustrated him more than the pain from his wound. Ayana adjusted the cloth on his ribs again, her fingertips careful and steady, and Rowan breathed hard through clenched teeth, fighting the urge to cry out because showing weakness felt dangerous even here. Though she kept telling herself she would leave then, she would not stay longer than necessary. She would not let herself depend on someone again. But every time her eyes flicked to him, lying there trying to hold on a breath, she felt the decision she made earlier stiffen inside her like metal locking in place. She couldn't abandon him now, not when he still fought to breathe, because she told him to stay alive. Rowan shut his eyes again as fatigue pulled him under, but he fought long enough to say a final truth, weak but certain. "If they come, I won't let them take you." Ayana's throat tightened because he meant it completely, even though he couldn't lift his arm, which made her chest ache with a mix of fear and unfamiliar relief since no one had spoken about protecting her without wanting anything in return. As Rowan faded into restless sleep, Ayana positioned herself near the cave entrance, knife in hand, shoulders tense, watching the way moonlight touched the canyon edges, ready to run or fight, depending on what shadows moved first. He had faced worse odds and lived, but right now he couldn't even defend himself, let alone protect her, and that frustrated him more than the pain from his wound. Ayana adjusted the cloth on his ribs again, her fingertips careful and steady, and Rowan breathed hard through clenched teeth, fighting the urge to cry out because showing weakness felt dangerous even here. But inside her head, a single new thought kept returning louder each time she tried to ignore it. Leaving tomorrow will be harder than I thought. But she answered anyway because he needed the truth. Maybe half a day behind, she said. I ran as soon as I saw a chance. Her voice was level, but underneath was fear and determination mixed together. I thought if I reached the hills, I could disappear. Her eyes flicked toward the ridgeline visible from the shelter. Steep rock faces leading in a thick brush that could hide a person for days if they knew how to move quietly. Rowan considered the options, his mind working with the slow but steady precision of a man who'd spent most of his years making decisions that meant life or death. And he asked, "Is there somewhere we can go?" Because staying in one place meant waiting to be found. My tribe was north, she said, eyes flickering with something like longing that she tried to hide. But they travel. I don't know where they are now. Rowan nodded, understanding that running blind toward hope was just as dangerous as standing still. We need the horse, he decided, and she glanced toward the brush where the tracks disappeared, doubt crossing her face because catching a horse while half dying sounded like an impossible plan. But he explained, once I can ride, once we have some distance, I can get us to a doctor or a fort, somewhere they won't dare follow. And he believed it enough to make his voice firm, even though each word cost him effort. Ayanna looked at him long enough to decide whether that confidence was real or just a man pretending he wasn't broken, and she saw in his expression the same stubbornness that kept him alive through the night. So she nodded once. Then you must move today, she said, before they find the trail, because she knew tracking. Every footprint they left, every bent blade of grass, could guide pursuit like a map. Rowan breathed out hard, preparing himself to stand though his chest burned deep, and before he tried it, he looked at her again and asked the question that mattered most to him right now. Why didn't you leave while I slept? Because he saw how she fought exhaustion and fear the entire night, holding a knife instead of letting safety in. Ayanna looked away, her voice dropping lower. You were breathing wrong, she admitted quietly. I thought you might die if I left. And the truth slipped out before she could pull it back. A truth that surprised even her, because she spent so long convincing herself she owed survival only to herself. But something about seeing him fight for each breath made leaving impossible. Rowan held her gaze, and something unspoken settled between them. Not trust yet, but recognition. That they were both hurting people who still chose to help someone else, even when they had nothing to gain. That he braced, his hand against the rock, preparing to stand, and she moved to his side, ready to steady him without needing to be told. He had faced worse odds and lived, but right now, he couldn't even defend himself, let alone protect her, and that frustrated him more than the pain from his wound. Ayanna adjusted the cloth on his ribs again, her fingertips careful and steady, and Rowan breathed hard through clenched teeth, fighting the urge to cry out because showing weakness felt dangerous even here. When he pushed upward, the pain nearly made his legs buckle, his teeth gritting. A low groan forced past his defenses, but he stayed upright, sweat dripping down his neck, breath shaky but determined. That's enough for now, she said, her hand gripping his arm to keep him steady. Though she knew he would push himself harder regardless of what she said. They stepped slowly toward the canyon entrance, Rowan leaning heavily on the wall, the world spinning for a moment before leveling again, and he scanned the landscape, calculating distance, escape routes, and where a horse might wander after fleeing gunfire. Ayanna watched the road, always expecting figures to appear, and Rowan noticed the way her shoulders stiffened each time the wind carried. Distant echoes of anything. A shifted rock, a restless bird, because she had lived too long under someone else's control to believe peace lasted more than a minute. We'll take it slow, he said quietly, more to show her he wasn't giving up than to reassure himself. One step, then another. She nodded, keeping close, her presence steady even though fear still lingered deep in her bones. Rowan took a shaky breath, eyes fixed ahead. The horse, safety, any future at all. And for the first time in months, he felt like the decision to keep living wasn't just for himself anymore, because she looked terrified and stubborn and hopeful all at once, and he knew without doubt. He wasn't walking only for survival now, but he was walking because she stayed. He had faced worse odds and lived, But right now, he couldn't even defend himself, let alone protect her, and that frustrated him more than the pain from his wound. Ayana adjusted the cloth on his ribs again, her fingertips careful and steady, and Rowan breathed hard through clenched teeth, fighting the urge to cry out because showing weakness felt dangerous even here. Rowan stepped out from the shelter into the cold morning air, each breath cutting sharp against his lungs, his body hunched slightly forward to protect the wound that kept sending waves of pain through his ribs, and Ayana walked close beside him with one hand near his arm, ready to catch him if his legs gave out, because she understood he pushed himself far beyond what his body could handle. But she also understood why he tried. Survival demanded movement. Hesitation only gave the hunters more time to close in. The canyon ground felt uneven under his boots, rocks shifting, and Rowan placed each step carefully, jaw clenched tight, sweat building despite the chill, his heart pounding unsteady from exhaustion and blood loss. But he kept moving because stopping meant death for both of them, and the thought of Ayana being dragged back in chains while he lay helpless inside that cave twisted a deeper strength out of him. Ayana scanned the dust for hoof prints, crouching several times to check the trail, and Rowan waited, leaning heavily against a large boulder, trying not to show how dizziness kept pulling his vision dark at the edges. She pointed toward the brush that stretched along the river's bend, footprints mixing with horse tracks. "He went that way," she said with certainty, her tracking skills sharp from a lifetime of hunting and hiding in harsh terrain, and Rowan nodded, though speaking cost him precious breath. They followed the faint trail until Ayana lifted a hand for him to stop, her body tightening as she listened. Rowan held still, steadying his ragged breathing enough to hear something too. A soft huffing sound, the shift of hooves on stone, just beyond the brush a few yards ahead, where a sorrel horse stood tetherless and alert, his ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring as he recognized his rider. Rowan exhaled a slow breath of relief. "That's him," he muttered, and Ayana moved first, approaching carefully, palms open to show no threat, her footsteps soft, speaking gentle words in Apache under her breath, because she knew animals reacted to fear faster than humans did. Rowan watched how easily she calmed the horse, the animal lowering its head enough for her to grab the reins and stroke his neck. The horse snorted once but accepted her presence, and she led him back to Rowan, who placed a hand on the saddle horn, gripping tight while he fought to control the tremor running through his fingers. "I can ride," he insisted, even though his body nearly folded in half just staying upright. "You ride." "I lead," Ayana answered, her tone leaving no room for argument because she saw exactly how unstable he was and wouldn't risk him falling again. Rowan gave a reluctant nod. Trust wasn't easy, but she earned it with every decision she made in his favor as he pulled himself up with her help, boots slipping once before he swung his leg over the saddle and settled awkwardly, the pressure on his ribs forcing a sharp groan he tried to swallow, his eyelids squeezing shut for a moment before he opened them again, focusing forward. "Where to?" he asked, strained but determined. Ayana scanned the horizon, considering routes and dangers. "Toward the hills," she answered, pointing toward rugged terrain thick with brush and hidden passes, places that would slow riders chasing them long enough to decide the next step. "Then we search for help." Rowan nodded, knowing a frontier outpost, or even alone. Trapping cabin might be enough to get a doctor or supplies to finish what she started. They began moving slow, the horse walking carefully along uneven rock, Ayana leading with steady strides that kept her eyes forward and her knife ready in her belt, and Rowan kept watch behind them as much as pain allowed, scanning for dust clouds or silhouettes that might signal pursuit, because fear didn't grip only her anymore. Now he feared for her too. Silence stretched for several minutes, except for the horse's hooves and Rowan's strained breaths, and Ayana finally spoke, needing answers she had held back earlier. "Why were you alone out here?" she asked, her tone cautious but honest, because she wanted to understand the man she risked her life to. "Save." Rowan adjusted himself slowly in the saddle, the movement small but painful. Rowan watched how easily she calmed the horse, the animal lowering its head enough for her to grab the reins and stroke his neck. The horse snorted once but accepted her presence, and she led him back to Rowan, who placed a hand on the saddle horn, gripping tight while he fought to control the tremor running through his fingers. "I can ride," he insisted, even though his body nearly folded in half just staying upright. "You ride." "I lead," Ayana answered, her tone leaving no room for argument because she saw exactly how unstable he was and wouldn't risk him falling again. He answered after a moment, "I served in the cavalry too long." His voice carried a tired weight. "When the fighting ended, I stayed on because that's what I knew." He looked away from her, eyes fixed on the distance. "They owed me pay, years of it, after they sent me out to scout the border alone." Bitterness pressed the words flat. "On my way to collect it, someone decided I looked like easy profit." Ayana absorbed his story, recognizing the familiar pattern. Men in power using another until they had no more use for them. And she saw the truth in his tired posture. He wasn't a wandering outlaw. He was a man who gave everything for a country that paid him back with silence and danger. "You fight for others, not yourself," she said quietly, and Rowan didn't deny it, because living for himself felt like a foreign idea, one he never practiced after burying his brother and losing every reason to build something permanent for his future. "And you?" he asked after a moment. "Where would you go if you could choose?" A simple question, but heavy with possibilities she barely allowed herself to think about. Ayana walked ahead with a steady pace, but her jaw tightened and her eyes lowered. "Somewhere they cannot follow," she answered simply, not naming tribe or family because hope hurt when spoken out loud. Rowan understood that too well. Silence holding their grief side by side without demanding explanations. And that silence felt like the beginning of trust, even if neither of them wanted to admit it yet. They reached the first rise in the terrain, loose gravel sliding under hooves, and Rowan winced as each jolt pressed pressure into his wound. He answered after a moment, "I served in the cavalry too long." His voice carried a tired weight. "When the fighting ended, I stayed on because that's what I knew." He looked away from her, eyes fixed on the distance. "They owed me pay, years of it, after they sent me out to scout the border alone." Bitterness pressed the words flat. "On my way to collect it, someone decided I looked like easy profit." Ayana absorbed his story, recognizing the familiar pattern. Men in power using another until they had no more use for them. And she saw the truth in his tired posture. He wasn't a wandering outlaw. Ayana slowed down to help minimize the strain, but every step proved how little time they had because the pain burned hotter and his breathing turned uneven again, his words slipping out softer. "I need to stop just a moment." Ayana helped him down carefully, guiding him to sit against a thick mesquite tree that gave a bit of shade. She checked the bandage, noticing fresh blood seeping through, and frustration filled her eyes because she didn't know how long she could keep him alive without better supplies. Rowan saw that worry and forced a weak smile. "Not dead yet," he muttered, trying to lighten the weight between them. But Ayana didn't smile back, her mind already working through their situation. She washed the cloth again, pressing it back against his ribs with firmer pressure this time, and Rowan grabbed her wrist once instinctively at the pain, then immediately let go, meeting her eyes with apology and trust tangled together. "We'll find help," he said before she could speak the fear she carried, because he needed her to believe it, even if he wasn't sure himself. "And when I can stand without falling, I'll keep them away from you." A promise spoken without hesitation. Ayana stared at him for a long heartbeat, seeing the truth behind his voice. He wasn't helping her out of duty. He was doing it because he'd rather die fighting than see her hurt. She stood, checking the road behind them one more time, breath steadying as she whispered, "Then we keep moving," because leaving him to die was no longer an option in her mind. Rowan nodded, bracing his hand against the tree to rise again, pain flaring but endured, and Ayana stepped close to help without being asked. Ayana slowed down to help minimize the strain, but every step proved how little time they had because the pain burned hotter and his breathing turned uneven again, his words slipping out softer. "I need to stop just a moment." Ayana helped him down carefully, guiding him to sit against a thick mesquite tree that gave a bit of shade. She checked the bandage, noticing fresh blood seeping through, and frustration filled her eyes because she didn't know how long she could keep him alive without better supplies. Together they prepared to push forward because the world behind them meant chains and death, and the world ahead, dangerous as it was, offered a chance neither of them had dared to hope for until they found each other in the dust and cold. And though neither spoke it aloud, both now understood one thing clearly. Survival was no longer just a duty. It was a shared purpose. The sun climbed higher as they pushed deeper into the hills, the air warming, but not enough to ease the chill that clung to Rowan's skin as fever began tugging harder at his body. His breaths turned short and harsh, sweat sliding down the side of his face even though he shivered under his coat, and Ayanna kept glancing back at him, her eyes tense with worry because she could see he was losing strength faster than they were gaining distance. Rowan tried to hide the way his hand shook when he gripped the saddle horn, because showing weakness meant slowing down, and slowing down meant giving their pursuers time to catch up. After the last incline, his vision blurred, colors smearing together, and the world tilted enough that he nearly fell if Ayanna hadn't caught his leg and steadied him. Her voice came low but firm. "We stop now." And he wanted to argue, but no sound came out strong enough to make a point. She found a patch of shade beneath a cluster of tall rocks and guided the horse there, helping Rowan down carefully. His boots hit the ground, and his knees folded instantly. The pain exploding through his ribs with such force, he pressed his forehead into the dirt to keep from yelling, breath coming thin like his lungs refused to pull air deep enough to survive. Ayanna grabbed his shoulders, forcing him upright against the rocks, and she pressed her palm to his forehead, which radiated too much heat. Her jaw tightened with fear she didn't show out loud, because fever meant the infection was spreading, and she knew a man could die from sickness just as easily as from a bullet. She grabbed the canteen, helping him take small sips of water, because too much too fast might make him choke. Rowan leaned against her hand, eyes half shut, voice trembling from effort when he asked, "How far you think to help?" She answered honestly because lying served no one now. "There's a trading post 2 days west," she said, checking the bandage that was soaked through again. "Sometimes a doctor comes there." She didn't mention that the doctor also treated the hunters who once held her captive, which meant risk waited on both sides of that place. Rowan forced his eyes open, staring at her with tired clarity. 2 days, he muttered with a dry laugh that cracked into a cough. "I might only have one." Ayanna's expression hardened with refusal that came from somewhere deeper than reason. "You stay alive," she said, sharper than she meant, but she didn't care how harsh it sounded. Her jaw tightened with fear she didn't show out loud, because fever meant the infection was spreading, and she knew a man could die from sickness just as easily as from a bullet. She grabbed the canteen, helping him take small sips of water because too much too fast might make him choke. She needed him to hold on. "We will make it." Rowan saw in her eyes that she wasn't saying it to comfort him. She was making a command, one she expected him to obey. Ayanna tore new strips from what remained of her dress, tightening the fresh bandage around his ribs while Rowan clenched his jaw so hard a sharp ache spread up into his temple. But he didn't pull away. Not once, because her hands worked with determination, and he found strength in that alone. "Why do you care so much?" he finally asked, not accusing, just confused because he still believed he was a burden she should have abandoned to save herself. She didn't stop, her fingers still knotting the fabric while she answered without looking up. "You did not look at me like they did," she said, the words tight like pulling them hurt. Not like something to own. Rowan felt that strike deeper than he expected, because he knew exactly the kind of look she meant, and it sickened him once more that men like that walked free in this land. Before he could answer, Ayanna's head turned sharply toward the ridge, her posture shifting, knife sliding into her hand in one smooth motion. Rowan heard it too, distant echoes of hooves against hard earth, uneven but getting closer, a sound that carried intent like nothing else in the frontier. Ayanna moved quickly, pulling Rowan deeper into the shade of the rock formation, motioning for silence while she crouched low and peered through the cracks. 3 riders approached from the direction they had come, their silhouettes growing larger as they scanned the ground from their saddles, rifles strapped across their backs, dust trailing behind them. But Rowan's heart kicked rough and uneven, not just from fear, but anger, because the idea of being caught now, after pushing this far, filled him with a helplessness he refused to accept. His hand reached instinctively for his holster only to find the weapon gone, taken during the ambush, leaving him with nothing but will and pain. Ayana's voice came out barely more than breath. Stay still. Her eyes never broke from the riders who slowed near a break in the trail. One pointed toward the marks left by Rowan's boots, and another leaned down to examine them, nodding with a satisfied grimness because the tracks were fresh. Rowan forced himself to focus through the spinning rush in his head. You should go now, he whispered, the words heavy with desperation. They're here for you. Don't let me drag you down. But Ayana's grip tightened around the handle of her knife, her expression unmovable. I said I do not leave you, she replied, quiet but absolute. Rowan stared at her, shocked by the certainty in her voice because she had every reason to run, every reason to save only herself, but she wasn't running. The riders paused, eyes sweeping toward the hills, scanning every shadow. Ayana slid closer to Rowan, so he would not have to face them alone if they spotted the hiding place, her voice steadying his panic as she whispered, They will move on if we stay silent. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant call of a hawk circling high above. Finally, the riders urged their horses forward again, continuing along the lower route toward the ridge, dust settling behind them as their silhouettes shrank into the distance until they disappeared completely beyond the hills. Ayana didn't move until the last trace of sound faded, her muscles still tense from the effort of staying ready to strike. When she turned back to Rowan, she saw how pale he looked, his breathing shallow and fast, adrenaline fading into weakness again. She knelt in front of him, placing one steadying hand against his knee. We are not caught, she said, trying to offer him solid ground in the storm that kept pulling at him. You rest a little, then we move again. Her tone was firm but softer now because she saw how close he was to losing consciousness. Rowan looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time, not as a stranger dragged into his troubles, but as someone choosing to stand beside him no matter how dangerous it became. He swallowed hard, voice thin but full of something new. Thank you for staying. The gratitude wasn't a small thing. It was everything he still had to give. Ayana held his gaze for a quiet moment, her chest rising with a breath she didn't realize she held, and she finally replied, You would have stayed for me. Not a question, a truth she believed now, because she saw it in the way he spoke, the way he fought through pain every step of the journey. Rowan nodded, forcing strength back into his lungs one breath at a time. Because she was right. He would have done the same, and he would keep doing the same until the threat chasing them disappeared for good. They sat together in silence while the danger passed farther down the trail, and though Rowan's body weakened, something inside him stayed firm. When she turned back to Rowan, she saw how pale he looked, his breathing shallow and fast, adrenaline fading into weakness again. She knelt in front of him, placing one steadying hand against his knee. We are not caught, she said, trying to offer him solid ground in the storm that kept pulling at him. You rest a little. As long as she kept choosing to stay, he would not let death take him. Not here. Not now. Not with her future tied to his fight for one more day alive. Afternoon heat gathered on the rocks, but did nothing to ease the fever burning through Rowan's body. His skin was hot to the touch while his hands trembled uncontrollably, and Ayana knew they could not stay in the open any longer because fever slowed the mind and weakened the legs. If night came before they reached safer ground, the cold would finish what the bullet started. She guided him back onto the horse, his jaw tightening as he used the stirrup to pull himself up, breath shaking from the effort. Once he sat slumped in the saddle, Ayana led them up a narrow path through the hills, one she remembered from hunting trips long before captivity had changed everything. It was a place where a small stream cut through high rocks, hidden from the road below. Rowan kept his eyes half open, forcing himself to scan the horizon even as dizziness made shapes blur. He asked with a dry, unsteady voice, Will you find your people again? Because he realized they never talked about what would happen after they survived this moment, after the danger chasing them finally faded. Ayana didn't answer right away, her grip tightening on the reins as she climbed the rocky incline. When she finally spoke, her words came slow and honest. If I try to return, they may not accept me.
This story is produced by Wild West Love Story YouTube channel. Unauthorized use is prohibited. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications.
Rowan blinked, confused. Why? Because returning home should have been the safest idea, not something to fear. They think anyone taken is gone forever, she said, her voice steady but her eyes fixed hard on the ground ahead. Each word was heavy, like she had carried them too long in her chest. Some believe the spirit does not return with the body. Rowan understood enough to feel a deep ache settle inside him. Because she wasn't only running from captors, she was running from judgment, from shame forced onto her by others. You were taken, he said quietly, not lost. Ayana's eyes flickered briefly to his before she looked away again. The truth striking a part of her she tried not to feel. Believing him was dangerous. Believing she still had a place in the world made survival heavier. The path narrowed, and Ayana stopped suddenly, holding up a hand for Rowan to stay silent as she listened, her posture alert, knife ready in her other hand. Rowan tensed too, thinking the riders doubled back, but she whispered, "Not them." Moments later, the sound of running water reached their ears. Relief pricked Rowan's chest, though it immediately mixed with pain, and Ayana led the horse into a concealed space between jagged stone walls where a thin stream flowed, shielded from the wind. What remained of daylight could not easily reach here, the air cooler and safer. She helped Rowan off the horse, lowering him carefully beside the water. He fell to his knees, one hand digging into the dirt as he tried to keep his breath even. The fever made his head heavy and his thoughts scatter like loose grain, but he forced himself to stay aware because falling unconscious here meant placing all the burden on her, and he refused to do that. Ayana soaked her cloth again, pressing it to his neck, wiping sweat from his brow. Rowan stared at her through fogged vision, words thick on his tongue. "You should rest too," he said, because she looked exhausted, her movements slower, her face drawn from too many hours of fear and work. No, the word came sharply at first, instinct rising, but then she softened. Later, trusting him enough to rest beside him still felt like stepping too close to the edge of something she couldn't name. Something safer than fear, but more dangerous because of how badly she already needed it. He watched her in silence, studying every detail, the determined set of her jaw, the scars marking her wrists, the way she listened constantly to the world around them. And he realized something he hadn't admitted out loud. She wasn't just protecting him out of obligation. She was staying because something inside her refused to let him slip away like so many others had. Rowan tried to pull his coat tighter around himself, but his hand shook too violently, and Ayana stepped in, adjusting the coat over his injured side with careful hands, her touch gentle. He felt the warmth of her fingers even through the thick fabric, a small reminder that he wasn't fighting alone. "You said you were owed pay," she spoke quietly, shifting the subject before his fever dragged him deeper into unconscious thought. "What will you do when you get it?" Rowan's breath slowed as he thought about the question, because he never planned beyond collecting what was promised to him. "I haven't decided," he admitted, voice raw with truth. "I thought about buying land, starting over." Ayana watched his face closely, wondering if that dream was real or something people said when they didn't want to admit they were lost. "Alone?" she asked, not accusing, just touching the emptiness behind the idea. Rowan's eyes met hers, with a stillness that held meaning too heavy for fever to steal. "I've been alone a long time." And he realized something he hadn't admitted out loud. She wasn't just protecting him out of obligation. She was staying because something inside her refused to let him slip away, like so many others had. Rowan tried to pull his coat tighter around himself, but his hand shook too violently, and Ayana stepped in, adjusting the coat over his injured side with careful hands, her touch gentle. "Didn't think I deserved more." Ayana looked away because she recognized the same belief shaping her own heart, that survival without belonging was the best she could hope for. She pressed her palm to his forehead again, checking the heat rising there. Rowan's eyes drifted shut for a moment, but he forced them open, unwilling to leave her to watch the world by herself. "You should sleep, just a little," he murmured, but she shook her head. "If I sleep, you might not wake," she said quietly. Rowan didn't argue because she wasn't wrong. The fever sat close to a breaking point, and if infection won tonight, the story would end here in silence and cold. He tried to sit up straighter, pushing against the rock behind him, breath shaking as he fought the pull of exhaustion. Ayana saw the effort and placed her hand lightly over his chest to steady him, her voice calm but commanding. "Rest. I will keep watch." Rowan nodded once, surrendering to the truth in her tone. His breathing slowed. Ayana looked toward the fading light outside the hidden pass, her grip tightening around her knife again, because riders could appear at any moment. If they did, she would fight. Not because she believed she could win, but because dying free beside a man who treated her like a human being was better than living as property again. Inside, Rowan's pulse pounded unevenly, his mind slipping deeper into the fever's grip. But before sleep took him fully, he focused on her silhouette near the entrance, strong and still despite the fear they both carried. And the final thought that anchored him to consciousness for just a little longer was simple and clear. If he lived through this night, it would be because she did not let him go. Darkness settled fast inside the narrow rock pass, the air turning damp and cool as night took hold, and Rowan's fever pushed him deeper into a state where thoughts slipped away before he could hold them, his body shivering uncontrollably one moment and burning the next. But Ayana stayed close, wetting the cloth again and again to keep the heat from climbing too high, her hands working steadily even as exhaustion dragged at her muscles. She listened for hoofbeats constantly, every distant sound, stirring anxiety in her chest, because she knew their pursuers would not give up easily. Men like that believed they owned what they paid for, believed they had the right to chase her across every mile of hard land until she broke, and she would. Never let them put their hands on her again, not while breath still filled her lungs. Rowan muttered something under his breath, too soft to understand, and his face twisted in pain as he tried to shift, Ayana placing a calming hand against his chest to keep him from tearing the wound open again. And she leaned closer, saying firmly but quietly, "Breathe slow," guiding him through each breath. And he listened because even in delirium, he recognized her voice as the one thing anchoring him to life. He forced his eyes open enough to see her silhouette lit by the moonlight slipping through the rock gap, knife always within reach, and he whispered hoarsely, "You're still here." His voice barely sounded all but holding surprise like he expected. To wake alone, and Ayana answered simply, "No one is taking you," because leaving him now would feel like letting go of the one good decision she made in months. Time moved slowly, the hours marked only by Rowan's uneven breaths, the rustle of leaves outside, and Ayana's constant watchfulness, her exhaustion building until her eyelids dipped once, twice, and she snapped them open each time, terrified that losing a single moment of awareness would be the moment those men arrived. Rowan drifted, again trapped in a thick haze of memories and fear, flashes of gunfire on the trail, his brother falling lifeless into red dirt years ago, all the losses he buried deep now clawing at him through the fever. But then something steadier cut through. The panic, Ayana's hand gripping his tightly, grounding him with silent insistence that he was not alone this time. When his eyes opened again for longer than a heartbeat, Ayana saw clarity return with slow effort, and she leaned in closer, her brows pulled tight. "Tell me what you need," she said quietly, ready to do anything that kept him alive, but Rowan just shook his head once, speaking low, "You've done enough." Though Ayana didn't believe him, not when death still hovered too close, she looked over at his saddlebags, searching for anything that could help, and remembered a question she hadn't yet asked. "Those papers you carry, the ones worth killing for," she said, glancing back at him. "What do they say?" Because she needed to know if bringing him to safety meant bringing danger greater than the men already on their heels. Rowan's breathing steadied slightly as he considered how to answer, his mind sharp enough now to remember why he'd been traveling in the first place. "Proof," he said slowly, "that the army owes me every dollar they promised. Proof of command corruption, men stealing from their own soldiers." And Ayana understood more than he expected, recognizing how those in power protected their comfort by taking from those who had none. "Those riders," she asked, "are they army too?" And Rowan thought about the Apache saw on one man's coat, the rough condition of their gear, the way they shot without warning, and he nodded once, saying, "Hard by. Someone who wants the papers gone." And the threat stretched farther than she realized, reaching in a law and authority where trust rarely lived for people like her. Ayanna took that in with a sharp breath, realizing the men who chased them didn't just want to reclaim her. They wanted to erase Rowan's truth as well, silence both of them to make sure no one questioned their crimes. And that meant even a doctor or a fort might not guarantee safety, because enemies could be waiting beyond any door they knocked on. Rowan saw the shift in her expression and forced himself to say something he believed with everything he had left. "If we make it to the trading post," he muttered, eyes focused hard on hers, "I will find a way to finish what I started, and I will make sure they never touch you again." The promise shook her more than she wanted to show, because someone choosing to protect her without expecting obedience or debt felt almost unfamiliar. The night deepened, and Rowan's strength faded further, his words slurring at the edges as exhaustion pulled him down again, and Ayanna sat close enough to hear every breath, every small sound that told her he still fought for life, but her gaze never left the opening of the past for long. Fear always waiting to pounce the moment she lowered her guard. She could smell the rain long before clouds rolled overhead, a storm building somewhere beyond the hills, and she knew rain would wash away tracks, but also turn the ground into a trap if they needed to. Move quickly, and she whispered to herself. Morning must come fast, because daylight would give them a chance to put more ground between themselves and those riders. Rowan stirred once more, voice weak, touching her hand lightly. "Don't go," he said, not an order, not a plea out of fear, but a raw truth from somewhere deep in his chest, and Ayanna's breath caught, a sharp ache forming behind her ribs because she remembered saying the same words once to someone who didn't stay. "I won't," she answered without hesitation, her voice steady, and Rowan's eyes finally relaxed, his body surrendering to sleep again, but no longer trapped in panic like before, because he believed her now. Outside, the storm clouds thickened, lightning flashing faint. Behind the ridge, signaling the land was about to shift again, and Ayanna gripped her knife tighter, bracing for everything that morning would bring. New dangers, a harder journey, and stronger enemies waiting on the road. But as she looked back at Rowan, breathing easier than he had since yesterday, she knew one thing clearly. No matter what waited ahead, she was no longer running only for herself. She was staying alive for him too. Rain arrived before morning, sudden and heavy, water dripping through cracks in the rock above them and pooling near Rowan's boots, the air turning colder and thick with a metallic smell of wet earth. And Ayanna knew they couldn't stay hidden here much longer, because fever and cold together would kill him, faster than any pursuer. Rowan woke to the sound of water splashing against stone, his head foggy, eyelids heavy, but he saw Ayanna already preparing the horse, tightening the cinch, her hair soaked and clinging to her face, and he forced himself upright with a sharp grunt that made her spin toward him, eyes wide with concern. "You should be sleeping," she said, moving quickly to keep him from collapsing, but Rowan shook his head, breath jagged. "We can't wait," he muttered, because he understood the danger too. Rain would erase tracks, but it also gave their hunters cover to move faster without raising dust, and if those men searched the high ground, they would spot the entrance easily. Ayanna helped him onto the horse again, this time, bracing his legs so he wouldn't slip, and Rowan felt his ribs scream with each movement. But he gripped the horn tight, refusing to fall, because the only way forward was through the pain that kept trying to drag him under. They started down the narrow path, hooves clacking against slick stone, and Rowan's eyes kept darting sideways to check their surroundings even though rain blurred everything into shifting shapes. But before sleep took him fully, he focused on her silhouette near the entrance, strong and still despite the fear they both carried. And the final thought that anchored him to consciousness for just a little longer was simple and clear. If he lived through this night, it would be because she did not let him go. His voice barely carrying, he asked, "How far now?" Asking about the trading post, even though he knew they still had a long way to go. "A full day more," Ayanna answered, "if we move fast, though she doubted fast was possible anymore, but she wouldn't speak that fear aloud because Rowan needed hope as much as he needed breath. The rain eased, but gray clouds held tight over the sky when they reached flatter ground. And Iona studied the landscape ahead. Scattered junipers, shallow valleys cut by the stream, and rocky hills beyond. Her instincts sharp as she searched for safe routes. Her gaze catching a small plume of smoke rising in the distance. Faint but steady. Rowan saw it too and narrowed his eyes. Fire! Someone's there, his voice. Strained, and Iona hesitated, because smoke could mean help or new danger, a camp or a trap, and they had no strength left for a wrong guess. But before sleep took him fully, he focused on her silhouette near the entrance. Strong and still despite the fear they both carried. And the final thought that anchored him to consciousness for just a little longer was simple and clear. If he lived through this night, it would be because she did not let him go. But Rowan breathed out, "We don't have the luxury to choose," his tone hard because death chasing them left no other road. She nodded and led the horse carefully toward the smoke, the ground turning muddy from the rain, slowing their pace, and Rowan's breathing grew more uneven with every step, his lips losing color, sweat and rain mixing across his face as his body shook under fever. Iona placed her hand against his thigh to steady him as the horse climbed a slope, then the outline of a small wooden cabin appeared through the drizzle, tucked beside a cluster of tall stones, smoke curling from a crooked chimney, and Iona halted, listening intently, studying the place for any sign of riders or traps. When nothing moved, she called out. Once cautious but loud enough to be heard. "Is someone there?" Her voice carrying into the still quiet after the storm, but a moment later, the cabin door opened sharply, a bearded man stepping out with a rifle in hand, coat patched and worn, his eyes narrowing on the sight of a half-conscious stranger on horseback and a soaked Apache woman leading him. "Hold it right there," he barked, suspicion carried in every syllable, and Iona stepped immediately in front of Rowan, raising her empty hand, showing she posed no threat despite the knife at her belt. "He's hurt," she said urgently. "He needs help," her voice steady even though her heart raced. The man eyed Rowan's blood-soaked shirt, then Iona's bruised wrists, his frown deepening as he tried to piece together the story. "That bullet wound's turning bad," he muttered, lowering the rifle slightly but not fully easing his stance. "Who shot him?" "Men who will come for us soon," Iona answered without hesitation. "If you do not help, he will die." And the blunt truth lingered in the air between them while the man weighed the risk of inviting danger onto his land. Rowan, barely conscious, forced his voice out. "I can pay." Once we reached the post, and the man's eyes flicked back to him, judgment shifting as he saw not a criminal, but a soldier abandoned. Finally, the man nodded, stepping aside. "Bring him in then," he said gruffly. "But if trouble rides after you, I don't die for strangers." His honesty clear, but Iona still breathed relief because shelter and medicine were closer now than death. Inside, the cabin smelled of smoke, leather, and dried herbs, a single bed pushed against the wall, supplies arranged neatly on a rough table, and the man grabbed a tin of water and strips of cloth, pointing Iona to lay Rowan down. She guided him carefully, her hand steady even as Rowan groaned, teeth clenched hard against the pain. And the man inspected the wound with a practiced eye, muttering, "Lucky shot didn't tear." "The lung," then looking up, "But it's infected bad." Iona stepped forward immediately, voice urgent. "Can you save him?" The man met her gaze evenly. "I'll try," not offering false promises. That he heated a metal tool in the fire, preparing to clean out the infection, telling Iona, "Hold him still." And she placed one hand on Rowan's shoulder, the other gripping his good hand tightly, eyes locked with his because she needed him focused on her, not the steel approaching his ribs. Rowan saw the fear in her face and tried to breathe slower, grounding himself in the grip of her fingers as the man pressed the tool to the wound, steam rising, flesh burning. Rowan tensing violently, but not crying out because Iona's voice whispered, "Stay here, stay. With me?" And he clung to her words like they were the only barrier between him and the dark. The procedure felt endless, each second stretching long and brutal. But when the man finally pulled back, bandaging the area with fresh cloth and herbal salve, Rowan's breaths came deeper, his fever still high, but no longer in a deadly climb. "He'll live if he rests," the man said, wiping sweat from his brow. "But if those riders find this place, you both best be gone before they arrive." And Ayanna nodded, already knowing they couldn't stay longer than needed. Rowan's hand still gripped hers, even as exhaustion took him again, his voice barely a breath. "Don't leave." Ayanna leaned in close, her reply firm and certain. "I won't," sealing a promise with more power than either of them realized before now. As Rowan slipped into restless sleep, Ayanna turned to the window, watching rain fall in thin sheets across the valley, fear still coiled inside her, but hope rising now too, fragile but real. And while the storm outside raged on, inside the cabin something changed. Rowan was no longer dying, and Ayanna was no longer alone in the fight to stay free. Together, they finally had a chance, if they survived tomorrow. But before sleep took him fully, he focused on her silhouette near the entrance, strong and still despite the fear they both carried. And the final thought that anchored him to consciousness for just a little longer was simple and clear. If he lived through this night, it would be because she did not let him go. Rowan woke to the faint creak of wood and the smell of fresh coffee. His body still sore, but the stabbing heat in his ribs had eased, his mind clearer than it had been in days. And the first thing he saw was Ayanna sitting near him, her eyes fixed on the door as if any second it could burst open with danger behind it. When she noticed he was awake, relief softened her expression in a way she didn't try to hide. "You're still alive," she said quietly, and Rowan managed a tired smile. "Because you wouldn't let me die." Before either could say more, boots hit the muddy ground outside, hurried multiple steps, and the cabin owner stepped away from the window, jaw tightening. "Riders," he muttered under his breath. "3 of them. Looks like they found your trail after all." Ayanna moved instantly, helping Rowan push to his feet. He was weak, but standing, and that alone made her feel like they could survive this. Rowan reached for the revolver the man had placed near the bed. His injured arm shook, so Ayanna steadied his wrist with her hand. Their eyes met briefly, an understanding passing silently between them. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The cabin owner loaded his rifle and nodded toward the back door. "There's a low trail behind cabin. Follow the rocks, west till you hit the ridge. I'll buy you time." Rowan frowned. No man should pay our debt. But the man gave a short, grim smirk. "I ain't paying anything. Just enjoying a fight I can win." He slid the bolt into place and planted himself by the window, determined and unshaken. Ayanna slung the saddlebags over her shoulder, then helped Rowan outside into cold morning air that smelled of wet pine and smoke. The horse stood saddled and waiting. Rowan grabbed the horn and pulled himself up, face tightening with pain, but refusing to let it slow him. He reached his good hand down to Ayanna. "Ride behind me," he said. "I'll keep you safe." "No," she answered. "We keep each other safe." And she climbed up behind him, her arms holding firm around his waist. Gunshots cracked behind the cabin. Loud, sharp warnings that their time was used up. The horse surged forward as Ayanna clicked her tongue, guiding them into the narrow back trail. Rowan twisted enough to aim behind, firing once, forcing a rider to pull up short. The horse bounded up loose rock and wet grass, hooves slipping but pushing upward. "Hold on." Rowan breathed, tasting blood in his mouth. Ayanna tightened her arms, her heart pounding against his back, urging the horse faster. They reached the ridge just as the clouds peeled back, sunlight breaking through in bright bands over the valley. Rowan looked over his shoulder. The riders were slowed by rough ground, but still coming. There was one clear path forward. The trading post lay only a few miles ahead, just visible at the end of the trail, a cluster of buildings and smoke rising from chimneys. If they reached it, there would be witnesses, lawmen, safety. Ayanna leaned close, her voice steady. "We can make it." Rowan nodded, breathing hard. "Then let's finish this." They urged the horse onward, closer and closer, until, finally, the shouts of townsfolk cut the air and a pair of deputies stepped outside, rifles lifted, ordering the riders to stop. The pursuers skidded their horses to a halt, anger twisting their faces as the law stepped between them and their prey. Rowan and Ayanna rode straight into the center of the trading post, where people rushed forward. Ayanna slid off first, helping Rowan down before his knees buckled completely. The deputies took one look at Rowan's bandaged side and Ayanna's battered wrists and turned their attention on the men behind them. "These two are under protection now," one deputy declared. "You want to make a claim? You do it in front of the judge, not with guns." The riders cursed, tugged their reins hard, and turned back the way they came. The threat was gone. For the first time since the riverbed, Rowan felt his body ease. He sank down on the porch steps of the trading post, breathing deep, and Ayanna knelt beside him, studying his face as if she needed proof they finally made it. "What now?" she asked quietly, not afraid anymore, just unsure where to place her hope. Rowan looked at the town around them. Safety, law, a place where he could finally collect what was owed. But none of that mattered compared to the woman who saved him as he reached out, his hand resting over hers with a gentleness he didn't think he was capable of anymore. "I want land," he said, his voice steady and honest. "A place where no one can take what's precious. I thought I'd build it alone, but if you want a home too, you have one with me." Ayanna's breath stilled in her chest, her eyes flickering with shock. Then something brighter, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel for so long. She nodded once, her voice strong. "I stay," she said, "not a promise. A choice freely made." Rowan leaned his forehead gently to hers. No dramatic declarations, just the quiet relief of two people who survived because they refused to give up on each other. And when he spoke again, his words were simple but carried the weight of every mile they walked together. "We live together." Ayanna squeezed his hand, her heart steady for the first time in a long time. "Yes," she whispered. "Together. Their future, not owed, not stolen, but chosen, began right there in the morning light of the trading post. A future where neither of them had to face the world alone again. Ayanna stayed. Rowan stayed. They kept their promise, and they built a life they both deserved. Morning arrived slowly, gray light pushing away the shadows inside the rocky shelter. The fire little more than glowing coals by the time Rowan opened his eyes again, his body stiff and cold despite the heat that had kept him alive through the night, and Ayanna sat against the cave wall with her knife in her hand, but her head tipped forward, sleep finally forcing its way past fear sometime before dawn. Rowan studied her in silence, trying not to move because the wound in his ribs felt like a hot iron pressed in a bone each time he breathed too deep. But he took a moment to understand the scene around him since he remembered only flashes from the night before. Her face leaning close, the firelight against stone, her voice telling him to stay alive, the truth that men were hunting her and that she saved him anyway, even though he brought danger of his own, that he shifted slightly and pain shot sharp enough to make him suck a breath through clenched teeth. The noise small but enough to wake her, her eyes snapping open instantly, knife angled ready out of habit, and only when she recognized him did her shoulders drop a fraction as she put the blade aside, though not out of reach because survival taught her to never relax fully. "You're awake," she said, voice rough from too little rest, and she moved closer to check the bandage without asking permission. Because asking wasted time, and pain didn't give options out here where a single wrong decision could end everything. Rowan tried sitting up a little, using his good arm to prop himself against the wall, but the effort left sweat gathering along his hairline, his jaw tightening as he forced himself upright anyway, and Ayanna steadied him with one hand lightly pressed to his shoulder. Not because she expected gratitude, but because letting him collapse again would set them both back more than she could afford. He noticed how tired she looked, how her eyes kept scanning the canyon mouth, waiting for riders to appear, and he asked, voice steadier than yesterday, "Did anyone come during the night?" Because the idea of armed men tracking her while he lay useless ate at him more than the pain did. "No," she answered simply, tying the cloth tighter around his ribs. "But they will," and she said it like she'd already accepted whatever would happen when they arrived, which didn't sit right with Rowan, because she risked herself to save him and the thought of her being dragged away again while He could only watch made his hands curl into fists, even though they barely had strength. He looked down at the rope burns on her wrists, dark, angry marks that told a full story without her speaking a word, and he realized there was more he needed to understand before they planned their next move. So he asked carefully, "How far are we from the men who took you?" Ayana paused, tightening her jaw like she braced for memories she didn't want to think about.